Welcome to Shadow Liturgy. The auction block stood in the winter sun of New Orleans, weathered cypress wood dark with sweat and rain. The man standing on it was 53 years old. His hands bore the calluses of 2 decades of labor. His back carried scars from whips and leather straps. His eyes held something that resembled recognition when he looked into the crowd, searching for faces that would not come. 20 years earlier, those same hands had pulled his master from a flooded creek. The master had been thrown from his horse during a storm, knocked unconscious by a low branch, and was drowning in 3 feet of water when the slave reached him. The slave dragged him to shore, cleared his lungs, stayed with him through the night as fever set in. The master survived. He never forgot the debt, he said. He spoke of it often at dinner parties, in letters to relatives, in moments of self-congratulation about his own benevolence. On the day the master died, the estate was settled according to law. The inventory included livestock, furniture, land, and human beings. The slave who had saved his life was listed fourth after 3 mules. His value was assessed at $800. He was sold that afternoon to a cotton broker from Baton Rouge who needed field hands for the season. The buyer paid in cash. The transaction took 11 minutes. The slave's name appears in the estate documents. His story exists in fragments across plantation records, court filings, and the journals of men who considered themselves civilized. But the full arc of what happened to him after that sale is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded is the system that made it possible. What is documented is the architecture of law and custom that allowed one human being to save another's life and then be sold like furniture on the day gratitude should have meant something. This is not Solomon Northup's story, though his name appears in the title. This is about the world that created Solomon Northup. This is about the legal frameworks, the economic incentives, the philosophical justifications, and the cultural mechanisms that turned human beings into property and made that transformation seem natural to millions of people who believed themselves good. Solomon Northup was born free in July of 1808 in Minerva, New York. His father had been enslaved but was freed upon the death of his master. Solomon grew up knowing literacy, music, labor, and liberty. He married Anne Hampton in 1829. They had 3 children. He worked as a carpenter and a violinist. He voted in elections. He owned property. By the standards of his time and place, he was a man who had escaped the machinery of slavery by the accident of geography and his father's manumission. In March of 1841, 2 men approached Solomon in Saratoga Springs. They introduced themselves as promoters of a traveling circus. They said they needed a musician for performances in Washington. They offered generous wages. Solomon agreed. He traveled with them south, performing in New York, then Philadelphia, then Washington. In Washington, the men bought him drinks. He became ill. When he woke, he was in chains in a slave pen owned by a man named James Birch. The transformation from free man to slave took less than 48 hours. There was no trial. There was no formal accusation. There was no legal process that acknowledged his freedom or required proof of his enslavement. When Solomon insisted he was free, Birch beat him with a wooden paddle and then with a leather strap. The beating continued until Solomon stopped speaking about freedom. This was the first lesson of his education in slavery. Silence ensured survival. Truth invited violence. The slave pen in Washington stood within sight of the Capitol building. This proximity was not metaphorical. The pen was located on the south side of the National Mall, a short walk from where legislators debated the future of the Republic. The business of buying and selling human beings operated openly, legally, and profitably in the shadow of the government that claimed to represent the ideals of liberty. Foreign visitors remarked on this contradiction. American citizens learned not to see it. James Birch operated one of several slave pens in the district. His business model was straightforward. He purchased enslaved people in market, where prices were low, held them in pens until he could assemble a profitable group, then shipped them south to markets where prices were high. The profit margin on a single transaction could reach several 100%. The business required capital, connections, and the willingness to apply violence to maintain order. Birch possessed all three. Solomon remained in the pen for 2 weeks. During that time, he was forbidden to speak about his freedom. Other captives were brought in. Some were enslaved from birth. Others, like Solomon, had been kidnapped. The distinction ceased to matter once the chains were applied. Legal status became a matter of documentation, and documentation could be forged, destroyed, or ignored depending on the incentives of the men holding the keys. The shipment south began in late March. Solomon was transported with other captives on a ship called the Orleans. The voyage took approximately 2 weeks. Conditions on the ship were designed for profit, not comfort. Captives were confined below deck in spaces with minimal ventilation. Food was rationed. Water was limited. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Several people on the voyage died before reaching New Orleans. Their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony. New Orleans in 1841 was the largest slave market in North America. The city's economy depended on the trade. Auction houses operated openly on streets near the waterfront. Buyers traveled from across the South to purchase laborers for cotton plantations, sugar estates, and domestic service. Prices fluctuated based on age, health, skills, and perceived temperament. The market operated with the efficiency of any commodities exchange, because that is precisely what it was. Solomon was sold to a man named William Ford. Ford was a Baptist preacher and a plantation owner in the pine woods of central Louisiana. Historical records describe him as relatively humane by the standards of slaveholders, which is to say that he did not engage in the most extreme forms of cruelty that characterized the system. He provided adequate food. He did not separate families without economic necessity. He allowed religious services. These qualities earned him a reputation for decency among those who accepted the premise that one human being could own another. But decency within slavery was always conditional. Ford's kindness extended only as far as his financial interests allowed. When he encountered debt, he sold people to settle accounts. When he needed labor, he purchased people at auction. When his workers resisted, he employed overseers who used whips and chains to enforce compliance. The contradiction between his religious faith and his economic practice apparently did not trouble him deeply. He believed slavery was ordained by Scripture and regulated by law. Within that framework, he considered himself a good man. Solomon worked for Ford building structures and clearing land. He demonstrated skill in carpentry and problem-solving. Ford rewarded this competence with small privileges and verbal praise. But Ford's financial situation deteriorated over the following year. He accumulated debts to a carpenter named John Tibeats. Unable to pay these debts in cash, Ford transferred Solomon to Tibeats as partial payment. The transfer from Ford to Tibeats marked a descent into conditions that made Ford's plantation seem almost benevolent in retrospect. Tibeats was not a wealthy planter. He was a laborer and craftsman who aspired to higher status. He resented his financial position. He resented the people he held in bondage. He expressed this resentment through violence that seemed motivated less by economic logic than by personal fury. The first major conflict between Solomon and Tibeats occurred over the construction of a building. Solomon completed the work according to Ford's instructions, which differed from what Tibeats had specified. Tibeats accused Solomon of disobedience and incompetence. He began to beat Solomon with a whip. Solomon, who had maintained relative silence about his status for more than a year, resisted. He took the whip from Tibeats and struck him in return. This act of self-defense was legally impossible. Under Louisiana law, an enslaved person who struck a white person could be executed. The law made no exception for self-defense. The law made no exception for disproportionate violence initiated by the white person. The power dynamics were absolute. Physical assistance by the enslaved constituted rebellion, and rebellion invited lethal retaliation. Tibeats attempted to lynch Solomon immediately after the confrontation. He gathered 2 other white men and they fashioned a noose. They placed the noose around Solomon's neck and threw the rope over a tree branch. Solomon was saved only by the intervention of an overseer from Ford's plantation named Chapin, who arrived as the lynching was beginning. Chapin drew a pistol and threatened to shoot anyone who proceeded. He invoked Ford's property rights, arguing that Tibeats could not destroy property that legally still belonged partly to Ford due to outstanding debts. The intervention was not motivated by moral opposition to lynching. It was motivated by economic calculation. Ford still held a financial interest in Solomon's labor. Destroying that labor without compensation would constitute theft. The law protected property rights even when it did not protect human rights. Solomon's life was preserved not because he possessed inherent dignity or legal standing, but because he represented capital that another man did not wish to lose. Tibeats left to consult with Ford about his rights in the matter. Solomon remained suspended from the tree with the noose around his neck for several hours while this consultation occurred. Chapin did not remove the noose. He simply prevented the lynching from proceeding until the property dispute could be resolved. Solomon stood on his toes to prevent strangulation. His arms were bound. He could not remove the rope himself. Other enslaved workers passed by during those hours. They could not help him without risking their own lives. This image crystallizes something essential about the system. Solomon was neither fully alive nor fully dead during those hours. He existed in a legal and physical limbo, created by the contradiction between his status as property and his reality as a human being capable of suffering. The noose remained around his neck not because of malice in that particular moment, but because removing it was not anyone's priority once the immediate threat of execution had passed. Ford eventually resolved the financial dispute by selling Solomon to another planter named Edwin Epps. The sale eliminated Tibeats from the equation and removed Solomon from immediate danger of lynching. But the sale also marked Solomon's descent into the worst conditions he would experience during his 12 years of enslavement. Edwin Epps owned a cotton plantation in Bayou Boeuf, approximately 20 miles from where Solomon had worked for Ford. Epps was not unusually cruel by the standards of cotton plantation owners, which is precisely what made him so representative of the system. He did not engage in torture for entertainment. He did not kill enslaved workers capriciously. He simply ran his plantation according to the economic logic of cotton production in the 1840s, and that logic required brutality as a routine operation. Necessity. Cotton cultivation in Louisiana during this period was organized around a quota system. Each worker was expected to pick a minimum amount of cotton per day. That minimum varied based on the worker's experience and physical capacity, but once established, it became the baseline for judgment. Workers who failed to meet their quota were whipped. The number of lashes corresponded to the pounds of cotton they had failed to pick. This was not cruelty. This was management. Epps conducted the weighing every evening. Workers lined up with their cotton bags. Epps or his overseer weighed each bag and recorded the amount. Workers who fell short of their quota were whipped immediately. The whippings took place in front of the other workers. This served multiple purposes. It punished the individual who had underperformed. It demonstrated the consequences of failure to everyone else. It established a rhythm of violence that became normalized through repetition. Solomon learned to meet his quota. He was not naturally suited to cotton picking. His hands, shaped by years of carpentry, were less nimble than those of workers who had picked cotton since childhood. But he developed the necessary speed through desperation. The alternative was nightly beatings. The body adapts to what survival requires. Solomon's body adapted to cotton picking the way it had adapted to carpentry, not through inclination but through necessity. But Epps's plantation involved more than cotton quotas. Epps was an alcoholic whose drinking intensified his capacity for violence. When drunk, which was often, he forced enslaved workers to dance for his entertainment. He played the fiddle badly and required others to dance until he tired of the spectacle. Solomon, who had once played violin in New York for audiences who paid to hear him, now danced to the drunken fiddling of a man who owned him. The inversion was complete. Skill that had once earned money and respect now served the whims of a violent drunk. Epps held a particular obsession with a young enslaved woman named Patsy. She was the fastest cotton picker on the plantation, routinely exceeding her quota by substantial margins. Epps valued her economically and desired her sexually. His wife, Mary Epps, recognized this desire and responded with jealous cruelty directed at Patsy. The result was that Patsy existed under constant threat from both the master and the mistress of the plantation. She could not escape Epps's sexual violence. She could not avoid Mary Epps's retaliatory abuse. She was trapped within a system that gave her no protection and no escape. The worst incident involving Patsy occurred after she left the plantation briefly to obtain soap. Epps interpreted her absence as an act of defiance or evidence that she had visited a neighboring plantation to see another man. When she returned, Epps ordered her stripped and tied to a post. He commanded Solomon to whip her. Solomon initially refused. Epps threatened to kill Solomon and whip Patsy himself if Solomon did not comply. Solomon, faced with the choice between participating in the torture or being killed while Patsy suffered anyway, complied. Solomon struck Patsy with the whip. Epps, unsatisfied with the force of the blows, took the whip from Solomon and completed the beating himself. He inflicted more than 100 lashes. Patsy's back was shredded. She lost consciousness. She survived, but the scars remained. Solomon was forced to participate in this torture not because he hated Patsy, but because the system was designed to turn enslaved people against each other when survival required it. Epps understood this. He used it. The incident with Patsy illustrates how slavery corrupted not only the enslaved but also the relationships between them. Solomon did not want to hurt Patsy. Patsy did not blame Solomon for what happened. Both understood that they were trapped in a system that gave them impossible choices. But the trauma of the event remained. Solomon carried the memory of striking her. Patsy carried the scars. The violence was distributed across multiple people, making it harder to assign simple moral categories while simultaneously making clear who held the power and who suffered under it. Solomon spent 10 years on Epps's plantation. During that time, he witnessed death, brutality, sexual violence, and the slow erosion of hope among people who had been born into slavery and expected to die in it. He also witnessed small acts of resistance and moments of human connection that persisted despite the system's attempts to destroy them. People sang in the quarters. They formed relationships. They shared food and information. They maintained dignity in circumstances designed to eliminate it. But Solomon had something most of the others did not. He had literacy. He had knowledge of his legal status as a free man. He had memory of a life outside slavery. These things became both a resource and a burden. They gave him hope that escape might be possible. They also made his imprisonment more psychologically unbearable because he knew what he had lost. Solomon attempted to write letters to contacts in New York who might verify his identity and secure his freedom. This was extraordinarily dangerous. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in Louisiana. Possession of paper and ink could result in severe punishment. Sending a letter required finding someone willing to mail it, which meant trusting someone who might betray him for reward or simply out of obligation to white authority. Solomon made several attempts. Most failed because he could not secure the necessary materials or find a trustworthy intermediary. The successful attempt came in 1852, 11 years after his kidnapping. Solomon befriended a white carpenter from Canada named Samuel Bass, who was working temporarily on Epps's plantation. Bass held abolitionist views, which were rare but not unknown among working-class white men from the North and Canada. Bass expressed these views cautiously, aware that open abolitionism in Louisiana could result in violence. Solomon observed Bass over several weeks before deciding to trust him. Solomon revealed his situation to Bass. He asked Bass to send letters on his behalf to contacts in New York. Bass agreed. This agreement required Bass to risk legal prosecution and physical violence for helping an enslaved man attempt to escape. Bass's motivation appears to have been genuine moral opposition to slavery rather than financial incentive. Such individuals existed, though they were vastly outnumbered by those who profited from or tolerated the system. Bass sent letters to several people Solomon identified as potential allies. Most did not respond, either because they did not receive the letters or because they were unwilling to become involved. But one letter reached Henry Northup, a white lawyer in New York whose family had once enslaved Solomon's father. Henry Northup responded not out of abolitionist conviction, but out of a sense of paternalistic obligation to the family of a man his relatives had once owned. The motivations were complicated, rooted in the same property relations that had created the problem, but they produced action. Henry Northup traveled to Louisiana armed with documentation proving Solomon's free status. This documentation included affidavits, court records, and testimony from people who had known Solomon in New York. Under Louisiana law, a free person wrongfully enslaved could theoretically be released if adequate proof of their status was provided. The law existed to protect the property rights of free black people and to prevent the kidnapping of free individuals, which created legal complications for the slave trade. The law was not designed to protect enslaved people as a class, but it could sometimes be invoked to rescue individuals who could prove they did not belong to that class. Henry Northup located Solomon on Epps's plantation in January of 1853. He presented the documentation to local authorities. Epps contested the claim, arguing that he had purchased Solomon in good faith and that removing Solomon constituted theft of his property. The legal dispute required hearings and the evaluation of evidence. Throughout this process, Solomon remained on the plantation, uncertain whether the legal system would recognize his freedom or prioritize Epps's property claim. The authorities ultimately ruled in Solomon's favor. The documentation was sufficient. Solomon was declared legally free. He was released from Epps's custody on January 4, 1853. He had been enslaved for 12 years. His release was not the result of moral awakening or systemic change. It was the result of paperwork and the intervention of a white lawyer who had the resources and connections to navigate the legal system on behalf of one individual. Solomon returned to New York. He reunited with his family. Why? His wife had maintained the household and raised their children during his absence. His children had grown. His daughter had married. Life had continued without him, which was perhaps more disorienting than if time had stopped. He had lost 12 years. His family had adapted to his loss. The reunion was joyful and strange and incomplete because the person who returned was not quite the person who had left. Solomon wrote a narrative of his experiences. The book was titled 12 Years a Slave and was published in 1853 with the assistance of David Wilson, a white lawyer and writer who served as editor. The narrative was immediate, detailed, and powerful. It sold more than 30,000 copies in its first 3 years of publication. It became one of the most widely read slave narratives of the 19th century, second in influence perhaps only to Frederick Douglass's autobiography. The book served multiple purposes. It provided testimony about the realities of slavery from someone who had experienced both freedom and bondage. It confirmed the fears of abolitionists about kidnapping and the illegal enslavement of free black people. It offered Northern readers a detailed account of plantation life in the Deep South. It was also a commercial product, sold for profit in a marketplace that consumed narratives of suffering as entertainment and education. Solomon's narrative included descriptions of violence, but he was careful not to sensationalize. He described the whipping of Patsy in clinical detail. He described the near lynching after his fight with Tibeats. He described the conditions on the Orleans and the slave pen in Washington. But he also described moments of relative calm, instances of kindness from unlikely sources, and the complex social dynamics among enslaved people. The narrative was not propaganda in the sense of exaggerating for effect. It was testimony designed to be believed. The publication of the narrative created legal consequences. Solomon's account implicated James Birch and the men who had kidnapped him. Birch was indicted in Washington on charges related to illegal enslavement. But the indictment went nowhere. The case never came to trial. Birch was never punished. The men who had kidnapped Solomon were never identified with certainty or prosecuted. The legal system had been willing to restore Solomon's freedom once adequate documentation was provided, but it was not willing to punish those who had stolen it. This gap between restoration and accountability was typical. The law occasionally corrected individual injustices when they became impossible to ignore or when powerful individuals intervened. But the law did not punish the perpetrators of those injustices in ways that would deter future crimes. The incentive structure remained intact. Kidnapping free black people was profitable. The risk of prosecution was minimal. The system continued. Solomon spent the remaining years of his life working with abolitionist organizations. He gave lectures about his experiences. He participated in efforts to assist other kidnapped individuals. He used his story to argue against slavery and to highlight the vulnerability of free black people in a nation where enslavement was legal and lucrative. His work contributed to the growing abolitionist movement in the 1850s, a movement that would eventually help precipitate the Civil War. But Solomon's personal fate after 1857 is uncertain. The historical record contains no definitive information about when or where he died. He disappears from documentation. Some historians believe he died around 1863. Others suggest he may have lived longer. His grave has never been conclusively identified. The man who provided one of the most detailed accounts of American slavery vanished from history without a clear ending. This disappearance is thematically appropriate, even if it is historically frustrating. Solomon Northup existed in the historical record because he was kidnapped, enslaved, and then freed through legal intervention. Once his legal status was secure and his narrative was published, he ceased to be exceptional in ways that generated documentation. He became one among millions of black Americans navigating life in a nation that had recently declared them human but had not yet decided whether they were citizens. The question that haunts Solomon's story is not whether slavery was evil. That question was answered by the testimony of those who experienced it. The question is how a system this brutal operated for centuries with the participation and support of millions of people who considered themselves good. The answer lies not in individual cruelty, but in legal architecture, economic incentives, and cultural narratives that made atrocity seem normal. The legal framework of American slavery was constructed over generations. It did not emerge fully formed. It developed through legislation, court decisions, and customary practices that hardened into law. Each element of the system was justified at the time as necessary, reasonable, or consistent with natural order. The cumulative effect was a regime that stripped certain human beings of legal personhood and transformed them into property. The foundation was racial classification. Early colonial laws did not clearly distinguish between enslaved Africans and indentured servants from Europe. Both groups performed forced labor. Both could be bought and sold. But over the course of the 17th century, laws began to formalize racial distinctions. Virginia passed laws in the 1660s that made slavery hereditary through the mother and specifically tied enslavement to African ancestry. These laws created a caste system in which race determined legal status at birth. By the 18th century, slave codes in every southern colony and state had established comprehensive regulations governing the lives of enslaved people. SA codes prohibited literacy. They prohibited assembly without white supervision. They prohibited ownership of weapons. They prohibited testimony against white people in court. They established patrol systems to capture people who attempted to escape. They prescribed brutal punishments for resistance or disobedience. The codes were not primarily about controlling individuals. They were about constructing a system that would remain stable across generations despite the fundamental instability of holding human beings in bondage against their will. The system required constant vigilance and routine violence because people naturally resist enslavement. The laws created mechanisms to make that resistance as difficult and dangerous as possible. The economic incentive was profit. Slavery was not an anachronistic holdover from a less enlightened time. It was a highly modern system of labor exploitation integrated into global capitalism. Cotton produced by enslaved workers in the American South supplied textile mills in England and New England. Sugar produced by enslaved workers in Louisiana and the Caribbean sweetened the coffee and tea of middle-class families across the Western world. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and other crops enriched planters, merchants, shippers, and financiers. The wealth generated by slavery was not confined to the South. Northern banks financed the purchase of enslaved people and the expansion of plantations. Northern textile mills processed Southern cotton. Northern merchants profited from the slave trade and the trade in slave-produced goods. Insurance companies in New York and Philadelphia issued policies on the lives of enslaved people, protecting planters against the loss of their human property. The entire national economy was entangled with slavery. Moral opposition required economic sacrifice, and most people were not willing to make that sacrifice until the system began to threaten their other interests. The cultural narrative justified the system by portraying enslaved people as inherently inferior and suited to bondage. This narrative drew on religious texts, pseudoscientific theories about racial difference, and philosophical arguments about natural hierarchy. Ministers preached that slavery was ordained by God and referenced biblical passages about servitude. Scientists produced studies claiming to demonstrate the biological inferiority of Africans. Philosophers argued that some human beings were naturally suited to rule, while others were naturally suited to serve. These narratives were not the ravings of extremists. They were mainstream positions held by educated, respectable individuals who saw themselves as rational and moral. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, also wrote extensively about his belief in black inferiority and owned more than 600 people over the course of his lifetime. The contradiction did not prevent him from being celebrated as a champion of liberty. The cognitive DEI dissonance was resolved through the exclusion of enslaved people from the category of men whose equality mattered. The system also required the complicity of people who did not directly own slaves but who benefited from or tolerated the system. Poor white Southerners rarely owned enslaved people. Most white families in the South had no direct financial stake in slavery, but they supported the system because it provided them with a social position above enslaved people and free black people. The racial hierarchy guaranteed that no matter how poor a white person was, they were not at the bottom. This psychological wage compensated for economic deprivation and created a coalition between wealthy planters and poor white laborers who had little else in common. Northern complicity took different forms. Many Northerners opposed slavery in principle, but were unwilling to take political or personal risks to end it. They consumed products made by enslaved labor. They returned escaped slaves to bondage under the Fugitive Slave Act. They tolerated slavery in the South as long as it did not expand into Northern territories. This tolerance was often framed as pragmatism or respect for states' rights, but it functioned as permission for the system to continue. The churches were divided. Some denominations opposed slavery. Quakers and some Methodists took early stands against the practice, but most churches accommodated slavery or actively defended it. Southern Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian denominations split from their northern counterparts over the slavery question in the 1840s and 50s. These southern denominations developed theological justifications for slavery that portrayed it as a positive good and a vehicle for Christianizing Africans. The churches provided moral legitimacy to the system and made resistance to slavery seem like resistance to God. The political structure of the United States was designed to protect slavery. The Constitution included multiple provisions that strengthened the institution. The 3/5 clause counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation, giving Southern states more seats in Congress and more votes in the Electoral College. The Fugitive Slave Clause required Northern states to return escaped slaves. The prohibition on banning the international slave trade until 1808 delayed even minimal federal regulation. These compromises were necessary to secure Southern support for the Constitution, but they embedded slavery into the foundational document of the Republic. The political power of slaveholders shaped national policy for decades. The presidency was dominated by slaveholders or their allies from the founding through the 1850s. The Supreme Court was controlled by justices sympathetic to slavery. Congress was structured to give disproportionate power to Southern states. This political dominance allowed slaveholders to block abolitionist legislation, expand slavery into new territories, and enforce laws like the Fugitive Slave Act that extended their power into free states. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was particularly important in Solomon Northup's time. The law required citizens of free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. It denied accused runaways the right to trial by jury or the right to testify on their own behalf. It created financial incentives for commissioners to rule in favor of slaveholders. It imposed penalties on anyone who aided escapees. The law effectively nationalized slavery by requiring Northerners to participate in its enforcement. The act generated fierce resistance in some Northern communities. Abolitionists organized rescue operations to free captured fugitives. Some states passed personal liberty laws designed to obstruct the act's enforcement, but many Northerners complied with the law despite moral reservations, either because they respected legal authority or because they feared the social and economic consequences of resistance. The law demonstrated that slavery's reach extended far beyond the plantations where the labor occurred. The economics of slavery involved more than agricultural production. It included a complex trade in human beings that operated like any other market. Traders purchased enslaved people in regions where prices were low and sold them in regions where prices were high. The trade separated families routinely. Children were sold away from parents. Spouses were divided. Siblings were scattered. These separations were not acts of cruelty for their own sake. They were business decisions driven by the logic of profit maximization. The internal slave trade reached its peak in the decades before the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South to the Deep South to meet the labor demands of cotton and sugar plantations. This migration was one of the largest forced relocations in American history. It devastated families and communities. It also enriched the traders who facilitated it and the planters who purchased the labor. The slave traders were not marginal figures. They were businessmen who operated openly and legally. They advertised in newspapers. They maintained offices in major cities. They corresponded with planters about the availability and price of laborers. They were integrated into the commercial life of the nation. Their business was considered legitimate. The moral stigma that later generations would attach to slave trading did not exist in the 1840s and 50s, at least not among the people who profited from it. The slave pens where Solomon Northup was held were part of this infrastructure. James Birch's pen in Washington was one node in a network that extended from the Chesapeake to New Orleans. These pens functioned as warehouses for human beings. They held people temporarily while they were being prepared for sale or while traders assembled grow. UPS for Transport South. Conditions in the pens were designed for efficiency and security, not for the comfort or dignity of the people confined there. The voyage from Washington to New Orleans that Solomon endured was typical of the coastwise slave trade. Ships designed to transport enslaved people operated regularly along the Atlantic coast and into the Gulf of Mexico. These ships were not technically slave ships under international law because they were transporting people within the United States rather than across the Atlantic, but they served the same function. They moved human cargo from one market to another. The conditions were brutal. Disease was common. Deaths occurred. The people who owned these ships were respectable merchants who also transported cotton, sugar, and other goods. The auction houses in New Orleans were elaborate affairs. They were designed to facilitate the inspection and sale of human beings. Buyers examined people's teeth, muscles, and bodies to assess their health and capacity for labor. Enslaved people were required to perform tasks or answer questions to demonstrate their skills. The examinations were invasive and humiliating. They reduced human beings to livestock. This reduction was not metaphorical, it was literal. The same language used to describe the sale of horses and cattle was applied to the sale of people. The buyers at these auctions were planters, overseers, and speculators. They calculated the return on investment they could expect from purchasing a particular person. They considered age, health, skill level, temperament, and reproductive capacity. Women of childbearing age were valued not only for their labor, but also for their ability to produce children who would also be enslaved. This calculation was explicit. Planters referred to the natural increase of their labor force as a financial asset. The prices varied widely. A healthy young man might sell for $1,000 to $1,500 in the 1850s. A skilled artisan could bring more. Women with young children sold for less because the children reduced their immediate labor capacity. Elderly or sick people sold for minimal prices or were abandoned when their labor value fell below the cost of maintenance. The market was efficient in its ruthlessness. William Ford, Solomon's first owner in Louisiana, represented a category of slaveholder who troubled abolitionists because he did not fit the stereotype of the brutal tyrant. Ford was educated, religious, and by some accounts kind to the people he enslaved. He provided religious instruction. He allowed families to remain together when economically feasible. He did not engage in gratuitous cruelty. Yet he participated fully in the system. He bought and sold human beings. He extracted their labor for his profit. He used violence when necessary to maintain control. Ford's existence posed a problem for abolitionist rhetoric that focused solely on the cruelty of individual slaveholders. The problem was not just that some slaveholders were cruel. The problem was that the system itself was inherently violent and exploitative regardless of the temperament of the individuals who participated in it. A kind slaveholder was still a slaveholder. The kindness might make the experience of enslavement marginally less unbearable, but it did not make the enslavement legitimate or moral. Solomon's time with Ford was relatively bearable compared to what came later, but it was still bondage. He was still property. He could still be sold. His labor still enriched Ford without compensation. His family in New York had no way of knowing whether he was alive. His legal status as a free man was irrelevant because he could not prove it, and no one with power was interested in investigating his claims. The veneer of kindness did not alter these fundamental facts. The transition from Ford to Tibeats illustrated how quickly conditions could deteriorate. Tibeats was not a wealthy planter. He was a small operator who resented his position and took out his frustrations on those beneath him. He was violent, erratic, and incompetent. But the system gave him absolute power over the people he held in bondage. His violence was legal. His decisions were unquestionable. Solomon had no recourse. He could not appeal to law or authority. He could only endure or resist, and resistance invited death. The near lynching after Solomon fought back against Tibeats was a moment when the system's logic became completely transparent. Solomon had defended himself against an attack. In any framework that recognized him as a human being with rights, his actions would have been justified. But in the framework of slavery, self-defense was rebellion. Striking a white man regardless of provocation was a capital offense. The only reason Solomon survived was not because his actions were deemed justifiable, but because his death would have deprived William Ford of property. The scene of Solomon standing with a noose around his neck for hours while his status as property was adjudicated captures the existential horror of slavery more effectively than descriptions of whippings or other physical violence. He was suspended between life and death not because of anything he had done, but because the economic and legal systems had not yet determined who had the right to kill him. His suffering during those hours was invisible to the law. Only his value as capital continue 312 a matter. Edwin Epps, Solomon's final owner, represented the mainstream of the plantation system. He was not exceptionally cruel. He was not a sadist who enjoyed torture for its own sake. He was a businessman running a cotton plantation according to the standard practices of the time. Those practices required violence because they required extracting maximum labor from people who had no incentive to work beyond avoiding punishment. The violence was structural, not personal. Epps whipped people because the cotton economy required it, not because he was individually monstrous. The quota system on Epps's plantation was a form of scientific management applied to human labor. Each worker was assigned a daily target based on their capacity. The target was determined through observation and measurement. Workers who met their targets avoided punishment. Workers who fell short were whipped in proportion to their shortfall. The system created clear incentives and clear consequences. It was rational, efficient, and brutal. The system also created competition among enslaved workers. Those who consistently exceeded their quotas raised the expectations for everyone. Patsy's extraordinary picking speed made life harder for others because her performance demonstrated what Epps believed was possible. This dynamic turned enslaved workers into unwilling accomplices in their own exploitation. The system exploited not only their labor, but also their capacity for adaptation and their desire to avoid pain. Patsy's situation illustrated how slavery intersected with gender and sexual violence. She was valued for her labor, which gave her some protection from the most extreme forms of punishment because Epps needed her productivity. But she was also vulnerable to sexual violence from Epps, who asserted ownership over her body as well as her labor, and she was targeted by Mary Epps, whose jealousy manifested as cruelty that the law did nothing to prevent. Patsy had no legal recourse against either form of abuse. The whipping of Patsy that Solomon was forced to participate in was designed to humiliate and divide. Epps could have whipped Patsy himself from the start, but he forced Solomon to begin the punishment, which achieved multiple purposes. It demonstrated Epps's power over both of them. It forced Solomon to become complicit in the violence. It created a moment of potential resentment between Solomon and Patsy that could undermine solidarity among enslaved workers. The system was designed to corrupt everyone it touched. Solomon's decision to strike Patsy under threat of death was not a moral failure. It was a decision made under conditions where all choices were impossible. He could refuse and be killed, which would not have saved Patsy and would have deprived his family of any hope of his return. He could comply, which required participating in torture. There was no good choice. The system eliminated the possibility of good choices. Judging Solomon's decision from a position of moral comfort misses the point. The point is that the system created situations where human beings were forced to choose between different forms of complicity and suffering. The cultural life that enslaved people maintained despite the system was a form of resistance, though not always a conscious or organized form. The singing in the quarters, the religious services, the preservation of family bonds and communal identity, these were assertions of humanity in a system designed to deny it. They were also adaptive strategies that made survival possible. The distinction between resistance and adaptation is not always clear. Often they were the same thing. The religious life of enslaved people was complex. Christianity was imposed by slaveholders who believed it would make enslaved people more docile and obedient. The message preached to enslaved people emphasized submission, patience, and the promise of reward in the afterlife. But enslaved people developed their own interpretations of Christian theology that emphasized liberation, justice, and God's opposition to oppression. The same religion that slaveholders used to justify bondage became a source of hope and resistance for the enslaved. The spirituals that emerged from this religious culture encoded messages about escape and resistance. Songs about crossing the Jordan River or reaching the Promised Land were not only about heaven, they were about freedom in this world. Harriet Tubman used spirituals to communicate with people she was leading north on the Underground Railroad. The songs were a form of coded communication that slaveholders could hear without understanding. But religion also sometimes functioned as an opiate in the literal Marxist sense. The promise of justice in the afterlife could make present suffering seem bearable or even necessary. The emphasis on patience and submission could discourage organized resistance, the theological framework that made slavery seem like a temporary condition to be endured until God's justice was revealed could postpone the urgent political work of ending slavery in the present. The role of religion in slavery was contradictory, like so much else about the system. Solomon's literacy was a resource that most enslaved people did not possess. The prohibition on teaching enslaved people to read and write was motivated by the recognition that literacy was dangerous to the system. Literate enslaved people could forge travel passes, read abolitionist literature, communicate with allies outside the plantation, and document their own experiences. Literacy transformed an individual from an object that could only be acted upon into a subject capable of independent action. But literacy also made Solomon's enslavement more psychologically devastating. He knew what freedom looked like. He remembered it in detail. He could imagine his family's life continuing without him. He could calculate the years he was losing. For people born into slavery who had never experienced anything else, the imagination of freedom was abstract. For Solomon, it was specific and immediate. Every day of bondage was not just a day of suffering, but also a day stolen from a life he knew was possible. The attempts Solomon made to write letters were acts of extraordinary courage and calculation. Each attempt risked severe punishment if discovered. Writing required obtaining paper and ink without arousing suspicion. It required finding someone willing to mail the letter, which meant trusting a person who could betray him. It required crafting a message that would communicate his situation clearly enough to motivate action, but vaguely enough to protect him if the letter was intercepted. Most attempts failed. The successful attempt depended on the willingness of Samuel Bass to risk his own safety. Samuel Bass's decision to help Solomon is worth examining. Bass was a white man from Canada who held abolitionist views. He worked as a carpenter, a trade that brought him into contact with plantations and enslaved workers. He expressed his views about slavery openly enough that Solomon noticed them, but cautiously enough that he was not expelled from Louisiana or subjected to violence. His willingness to help Solomon appears to have been motivated by moral conviction, rather than financial incentive or personal connection. Bass's existence demonstrates that individual moral courage was possible, even within the system. But it also demonstrates how rare such courage was. Bass was one person among thousands who passed through the plantation south. Most did not help. Most looked away or rationalized or accepted the system as natural. Bass's exceptionalism highlights how thoroughly the system had normalized itself among the white population, northern and southern. The legal process of restoring Solomon's freedom was slow and uncertain. Henry Northup arrived in Louisiana with documentation, but that documentation had to be evaluated by local authorities who had no particular interest in freeing someone who was legally considered property. Edwin Epps contested the claim vigorously. He had purchased Solomon in good faith, he argued. He had invested in Solomon's labor. Removing Solomon without compensation was theft. The law that protected free black people from kidnapping conflicted with the law that protected white property rights. The resolution of that conflict was not predetermined. The authorities ruled in Solomon's favor, but the decision was based on the specific documentation Henry Northup provided. A person without that documentation would have remained enslaved, regardless of their actual status. The system did not presume freedom. It presumed slavery unless proven otherwise, and the burden of proof fell on the person claiming freedom. For most kidnapped free black people, that burden was impossible to meet. They lacked the connections, resources, and documentation necessary to prove their status. Solomon was fortunate that his father's former owners felt enough paternalistic obligation to intervene. The decision to release Solomon did not include any compensation for the 12 years he had lost. He received no damages for the suffering he had endured. His family received nothing for the years they had lived without him. Edwin Epps was not punished for holding a free man in bondage. James Birch was indicted but never tried. The men who had kidnapped Solomon were never identified or prosecuted. The system corrected the immediate injustice because the documentation was compelling, but it did not punish those who had perpetrated the injustice or create mechanisms to prevent similar injustices in the future. Solomon's return to New York was disorienting. He had left as a man in his 30s with young children. He returned as a man in his mid-40s whose children had grown into adults. His wife had managed the household alone for 12 years. His daughter had married a man Solomon had never met. His grandchildren did not know him. The reunion was joyful but also marked by absence. The family had adapted to his loss. They had grieved. They had moved on. His return required them to reintegrate someone who had become almost mythical in his absence. The psychological impact of 12 years of enslavement cannot be fully captured. Solomon had experienced relentless violence, constant fear, and the absolute denial of his autonomy. He had witnessed atrocities. He had been forced to participate in them. He had lived under the constant threat of death. He had lost 12 years of his life and could never recover them. The trauma of those experiences would have marked him permanently. Though the language to describe psychological trauma did not exist in the 1850s in the way it does today, Solomon's decision to write a narrative of his experiences was motivated by multiple factors. He wanted to document what had happened to him. He wanted to warn other free black people about the dangers they faced. He wanted to company in tribute to the abolitionist cause. He also needed money. 12 years of unpaid labor had left him without savings. The narrative was both a political act and an economic necessity. The complexity of these motivations does not diminish the courage required to write it. The process of writing involved collaboration with David Wilson, a white lawyer who served as editor. Wilson shaped the narrative for a white audience. He emphasized elements that would be persuasive to Northern readers who were skeptical of abolitionist claims. He presented Solomon as an exceptional figure, educated, articulate, respectable, rather than as representative of all enslaved people. This framing was strategic. It made the narrative more palatable to white readers who might dismiss accounts from people they considered less civilized. But it also reinforced hierarchies within the black community and suggested that Solomon deserved freedom because he was exceptional, rather than because all human beings deserve freedom. The narrative's commercial success demonstrated the market for slave narratives in the 1850s. Northern readers were curious about slavery. They wanted to understand it, but they wanted to understand it from a comfortable distance. The narrative provided that distance. It allowed readers to experience the horror of slavery vicariously without confronting their own complicity in the system. Buying the book became a form of abolitionist activity that required no personal risk or sacrifice. The narrative also served as evidence in the political debates over slavery. Abolitionists cited it as proof of the system's brutality and the vulnerability of free black people. Defenders of slavery dismissed it as exaggerated or exceptional. The debate over the narrative's credibility mirrored the larger debate over slavery itself. Both sides used Solomon's story to support positions they had already adopted. The story itself became a tool in a political struggle that would eventually produce a civil war. The failure to prosecute James Birch, or the men who had kidnapped Solomon, revealed the limits of legal remedy. The legal system had restored Solomon's freedom because he could prove he had been wrongly enslaved. But the system was not interested in punishing those who had enslaved him. The incentives remained in place. Kidnapping free black people was still profitable. The risk of prosecution was still minimal. Solomon's case did not establish a precedent that deterred future kidnappings. It was treated as an individual exception rather than evidence of systemic failure. The Fugitive Slave Act remained in force until the Civil War. The internal slave trade continued to operate. The plantation system expanded into new territories. The legal and economic structures of slavery grew stronger in the 1850s, even as political opposition intensified. Solomon's story was a powerful indictment of the system, but it did not change the system. Individual testimony, no matter how compelling, could not overcome the economic and political forces that sustained slavery. The political crisis over slavery escalated throughout the 1850s. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed new territories to decide whether to permit slavery through popular sovereignty. The result was violent conflict in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that black people could not be citizens and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. The decision outraged abolitionists and emboldened slaveholders. The nation was fracturing along sectional lines. Solomon participated in abolitionist activities during these years. He gave lectures describing his experiences. He worked with organizations that assisted escaped slaves and free black people at risk of kidnapping. He used his story as a weapon in the political fight against slavery. But the details of his life during this period are sparse. He did not generate the kind of documentation that would allow historians to reconstruct his daily activities or his internal state. The disappearance of Solomon Northup from the historical record after 1857 is frustrating because it leaves his story without a clear ending. We know he was free. We know he was reunited with his family. We know he worked for the abolitionist cause. But we do not know when or how he died. We do not know whether he lived to see the Civil War or the Emancipation Proclamation. We do not know whether he experienced the end of the system that had enslaved him. This absence of closure is thematically significant. Solomon's story was never really about Solomon as an individual. It was about the system. His narrative documented how that system operated. His disappearance from the record after his story had been told reflects the fact that the system continued regardless of his individual fate. His freedom did not end slavery. His testimony did not reform the law. His suffering did not produce justice. The system persisted until it was destroyed by war. The Civil War began in April of 1861, 8 years after Solomon's liberation. The war was not initially fought to end slavery. Lincoln's stated war aim was to preserve the Union, but the logic of war transformed its purpose. Enslaved people escaped to Union lines in massive numbers, forcing the government to decide their status. The military value of denying the Confederacy its labor force became clear. The moral argument that a war to preserve the Union should also be a war to end slavery gained political force as the conflict intensified. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in January of 1863, declared free all enslaved people in territories still in rebellion. The proclamation was a military measure rather than a moral statement. It applied only to areas under Confederate control, not to border states or areas already occupied by Union forces. But it fundamentally changed the nature of the war. It made clear that the destruction of slavery was now a Union war aim. It invited enslaved people to escape and join Union forces. It transformed the war from a political conflict over secession into a revolutionary struggle over the future of American labor and race relations. The war killed more than 600,000 people. It devastated the Southern economy. It destroyed the plantation system. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December of 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. The legal framework that had sustained the system for 2.5 centuries was dismantled in less than 5 years through violence and political upheaval. The change was revolutionary. It was also incomplete. The end of slavery did not produce racial equality. Solomon's story remains relevant because the work remains unfinished. This is Shadow Liturgy. Thank you for watching.